Okay, can you hear me? Hello, hello. Let's begin. Okay, welcome everyone to, I think this is now the 4th week of term. So this is the 5th lecture in the SLA module, Falling 2. Just a comment, and I'll also remind you at the end of the lecture, next week you're going to have me for 3 lectures, literally Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Ian, I think, is away. So there's going to be an explosion of SLA-related knowledge next week. But for this week, it's just this one lecture from me. Okay, so last week we looked at Krashen's theory of SLA, the model theory, or the monitor model or monitor theory. This week we are looking at things that kind of built on from that, particularly, well, the interactionist theory as well as the output hypothesis, which kind of built on the input hypothesis. And then also looking at something which came from a slightly different field, but then was applied to second language acquisition, so sociocultural theory, Vygotsky's theory, which was applied by, in particular, I think it was Merrill Swain. Anyway, so what we're looking at today is broadly the role of interaction, and you can kind of see sociocultural theory as also focusing on interaction, and then also adding output to all our discussion of input. Cool. All right, well, let's get started. There's quite a bit I want to get through today. So just kind of contextualizing where we've come from, we looked at linguistic approaches to second language acquisition, which we looked at the 2 modes of analysis, contrastive and error analysis. Then we looked at a more cognitive approach, which you could argue came from maybe a Chomskyan innatist view of how language is acquired. And that obviously was Krashen last week. And now we're looking at things which take into account the fact that language and language learning doesn't take place in a vacuum. It's not just an individual, but there's always some kind of interaction with other people in society. And that's why people are motivated to learn languages. And those social factors affect language learning. So that's just kind of contextualizing where we've come from and where we'll be looking today. Okay, so how important is interaction in learning? There's different values placed on it. In Krashen's case, his input hypothesis, as we looked at, was in effect that it's determined by CI, or comprehensible input. And so the interaction that needs to take place is primarily the provision of input by some person who is in a position of being familiar with the language. So first language speaker usually. So if we can just make some space for those who've arrived. Okay. And so the question is, well, how does input become comprehensible? In his formulation, it was kind of I plus 1. So whatever input your current competency in a language allows you to understand fully, plus 1. So it added some slight more complexity, and that's what makes comprehensible input that will also kind of engage your language learning faculties and help you to learn. Is this still working? Okay, it's not working. The battery seems to have died. Anyway, hopefully we won't have the noises from outside today. All right, so with interactionism or interactionist approaches to SLA, the idea is that there are certain things that occur in interactions which make the input that a learner would receive comprehensible. And so in general, it would be some kind of simplification strategy that occurs. And it's usually coming from the person that the learner is talking to or interacting with. So yeah, I mean, that obviously then requires two-way communication, or there's kind of input going back and forth. And in a previous version of this slide, the idea was that Krashen claimed that only one-way input was necessary for second language learning. I think that's a bit of a misrepresentation, particularly if you look at kind of what he's done over the years, over the last 40 years. But certainly the interactionists would say, well, Krashen said one-way input's important. We think actually two-way communication is crucial for language learning and language acquisition, more specifically, to occur. So I just want to draw your attention now, as we're talking through this, what we looked at last week, where the revised version of comprehensible input was communicatively embedded input. So you can kind of see why that revised concept or revised version of CI came about in light of what the theories that we're going to be looking at today. Okay. All right, so Michael Long came up with interactionist theory within SLA. And I mean, his whole idea was really just SLA takes place through conversational interaction. That's primarily where it takes place. And to use some philosophical language, it's necessary that there be some kind of conversational interaction when you are acquiring a language for acquisition to take place. It's not necessarily the sufficient condition. So there needs to be other things added onto it for that acquisition, but it is necessary. It has to be there. And the way that he described this is modified interaction. And going back to the previous slide, the idea of simplification strategies, that's primarily what he's talking about. That it's not just, I mean, for instance, if you understand my L1 and I understand my L1 and we are communicating or interacting, it's not necessary for me to typically modify the interaction so that you can understand what I'm saying, unless I'm using language from a domain of knowledge which is completely outside what you're familiar with. So if I'm a doctor and I'm talking about what to do in a surgery and using a whole bunch of vocab that you don't understand, but otherwise you are completely fluent in English, then there would have to be some kind of modified interaction where I would have to simplify the language that I'm using or use different modes of expressing what I mean in order for you to understand. So that's kind of the idea, but applied from between a learner of a second language and a first language speaker of that language. Okay, and the research shows that this is what happens. So for instance, if I'm trying to acquire Afrikaans or also some other language, whoever I'm speaking to will recognize that this person's trying to learn, they're trying to acquire this language, and maybe I'm speaking too quickly. It's clear that they're not understanding it. Maybe they'll slow down. That's one simplification strategy of where the interaction is modified from if it were everyone kind of knew the language. Okay, so at the core, I guess the claim of interactionist theory then is the necessary condition. This is a strong version of the interactionist theory, that both the necessary and sufficient condition for second language acquisition to occur is that there's participation in a conversation, in an interaction, and that interaction is modified in some way to make the second language accessible for the learner. And I mean, this is just another way of kind of saying, well, the inputs are the linguistic forms that would need to kind of be acquired and internalized by the learner, but then it's the interaction, which again, it's the whole idea of this theory is that the interaction is the crucial factor here for acquisition to take place. And that's in effect focusing on the functions that those linguistic forms, the language, the functions that language plays, which would be some kind of, you know, this is an interesting thing for you to do. This is where you can find food. You know, there's functions that language plays for you to do things in the real world with your hands, with your body, with your mind, for interacting in society. So in effect, it's those things that motivate language use and language learning. So you can kind of see where we'll go more into this in sociocultural theory, but it's ultimately the interaction where the functions that language provides for us becomes useful. Okay, so one way we can put it, again, this is a bit of a philosophical way of putting what interactionist theory is about. So you have two premises and then kind of a conclusion. The first is that modified interaction or interactional modification, two ways of saying the same thing, are what make input comprehensible. So you can kind of see they're relying on Krashen's comprehensible input as a concept that then helps them kind of develop new theory or a more appropriate theory. So that's the first premise. The second one then is that, and they're agreeing ultimately with Krashen in this, that comprehensible input promotes acquisition. But because interactional modification is what makes input comprehensible, therefore, it is necessary for acquisition, and it is what promotes acquisition, interactional modification. So that's kind of the moves that they're making, the way that they are differentiating themselves from Krashen's theory. Okay, so some of the ways in which then this modified interaction takes place. And you can kind of, if you were just to think about and imagine an interaction between a learner of a target language and then a speaker of that language, a first language speaker, that they would elaborate certain maybe complicated vocabulary items and say it in a simpler way. They would speak slower, they would use gestures. So in effect, non-linguistic communication through body cues. They'd also check in with you, like, you understand what I'm saying? Uyandiva, whatever, like, are you getting me? So clarification requests is the way of saying the same thing. Repetition as well comes up. Obviously, you repeat it maybe slower the next time. And then paraphrase is another way of just saying, kind of elaborating on something. So anyway, those are some of the ways that simplification takes place. And there's research to the effect that those things work. They help people comprehend the language that is being used for them. Okay, so here's just the image that I kind of opened the slides with. So the hypothesis is that kind of modified interaction is important. That is a way of saying that there are adjustments within a conversation, those simplification strategies that we just looked at. That then leads to comprehensible input, or that there's comprehension of input by the learner, and then that leads to language acquisition. So that's more or less, I guess, the interactional hypothesis. You can see how it's building on what we looked at last week, right? So that was focused, I guess, on input as being the necessary and sufficient condition, whereas this as well, actually, for that input to be comprehensible, there needs to be interaction, there needs to be the modified interaction. That's what makes it comprehensible. So it's kind of adding on an extra bit. It's complicating Krashen's theory to make it more accurate, more kind of evidence-based. I guess those were the reasons why it came into being. Okay, so just looking back then at, I guess, what Krashen did, input, particularly reading and listening as the modes for getting comprehensible input. And I think because of this, obviously when you're reading something, there's like a one-way communication, at least on the surface, right? Someone else has written something, you can't interact with that book or that thing that you're reading. And then likewise, when you're listening, if you're just listening and that's where comprehensible input comes from, it's kind of a one-way thing. And because of that emphasis, then some people view him as saying it's just one-way input. But if I think you read, and particularly after maybe his initial formulations of comprehensible input, he certainly does acknowledge interaction plays a role, particularly when it's an opportunity for the input becoming even more comprehensible, right? So he is, however, skeptical about output. So that, and this is where we're getting into ideas of the monitor and editing your output. He thinks that any output that a person who has learned or acquired a language that's a product of acquisition. It's not something that can lead in like a kind of a circular way to more acquisition. It's more just, there's input and it's all about the input. So that's what kind of the last point refers to. So we've looked at the interactionist theory. So that's Michael Long. And that's really just trying to modify the input hypothesis of Krashen. Then from a different domain, you have Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, which I think Vygotsky came up with it. Look, you'll have to correct me. I seem to recall it was in the 1910s or 1920s, but quite early on. And it only reached the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world and scholarship, I think it was like in the 80s, 70s, 80s onwards. So it's quite old, but it was at least in response to Krashen's theories. It was quite new at the time within the English-speaking academic world. And so Landolf was the main pioneer within second language acquisition of Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, and we'll just use SCT to refer to it. So SCT kind of changes things around. It's not trying to say that this individual and society are kind of separate, and you can understand second language acquisition in terms of there's the learner. It's more looking at a learner as kind of embedded within a social world and a whole bunch of social aims that give them motivations to behave in certain ways. And one of those is language acquisition. So that's kind of reconfiguring how this works. And because of that reconfiguration of the kind of the core concepts, that then has an implication if we elaborate that into how second language acquisition occurs. So acquisition takes place through collaboration and interaction. You can see it's similar to the interactionist hypothesis. The interactionist hypothesis didn't come out of sociocultural theory. It wasn't necessarily coming from Vygotsky. But there are many similarities, and that's obviously why we're grouping it together. So one of the ideas, I guess, also that sociocultural theory would claim is that the language learner is an active agent in the learning process. But then and the term mediation will come up. We're looking at it more now, but both the environment that they're in, particularly social environment, and then the interactions that they have, all of those things mediate learning, right? Or mediate acquisition, whatever the difference between those two things might be. And so you can never directly learn. It always has to be mediated through something else. So whether that, well, we'll get into that now. So some of the central concepts: mediation, scaffolding, self-regulation, and then the ZPD. It's not ZDP, but ZPD. And I'm not sure if you can see the small, it's pretty pixelated, but actually we'll get to the ZPD now. Okay, so mediation is all about how there are things like, there are tools that help mediate learning, signs, symbols. So I guess the primary one, particularly for all of you right now, for instance, that's mediating the learning that you're doing is language. Some of the other tools that are helping mediate your learning is maybe if you're taking notes, so you can view the pen or the note-taking technology as something that mediates your learning because it enables you to outsource your memory onto a page. So that's kind of like a tool that you're using, right? And that's one of the ways in which you internalize knowledge. So there's something else that mediates you actually learning, becoming automatic, being able to just at will, produce or output something. You can kind of see how this is going to then apply to language learning. So, and also just to say, sociocultural theory is applied to second language acquisition. It's not a theory that's specific to second language acquisition. So it also has applications elsewhere in psychology, sociology, particularly educational, the sociology of education. Okay, so as far, and this is, I think, how Swain applied then sociocultural theory to language, second language acquisition, that language becomes a tool for thinking and problem solving in achieving the functions that interaction is all about, like I want to get food. So, and you can also see, you can view first language acquisition in terms of sociocultural theory. What, for instance, does an infant want? And the way that they communicate that. At first, they aren't using the tool of language, of at least linguistic information. They're using other things. I mean, you could maybe say that crying is like a kind of language, and there's a certain cry for when they need a nappy change, and there's a certain cry for when they're hungry, et cetera, et cetera. But then gradually, as they develop, they learn more complex tools to help them achieve the functions of bodily fulfillment, social fulfillment, etc., etc. But specifically for language learning, the language that we acquire is almost always in the context of some kind of further aims that we have in life. So problem solving, we want to think more clearly, so we want to acquire concepts that will help us structure our thoughts, etc., etc. And so some of these tools, yeah, like you can see that picture there, are written text, visual aids, also other people. I mean, obviously it's not nice in a narrow sense to think of a person as a tool, but as a mediator, they are often the way through which we can learn things, right? So various forms of communication, whether media or mediators, you can see that as people maybe. Okay, so that was mediation, which is a kind of a core concept of sociocultural theory. Another core one, which if you were to just do a simple Google search and kind of look at the main SCT pillars, scaffolding would be another. And this is a way of kind of specifying what it is that particularly other people, as mediators of whatever they're mediating, in this case language, they provide support. And so scaffolding is a metaphor that is being used here. I mean, you can think of all the scaffolding that's out the front kind of tower building at the moment. What does that do? Those are tools that enable the builders and the people who are working on the building to achieve their aims, right? And so what scaffolding does in the context, I'm not sure if it's here, but any learner requires some degree of scaffolding to learn, I guess, a new concept or a new word or a new structure. And that needs to come from somewhere. So in the case of Vygotsky's theory, it would be a more knowledgeable other. So that's another acronym which you'll encounter now. Yeah, and I guess at a kind of a small scale level, that would be providing prompts, cues, modeling how you say something, feedback on what as a learner you've said, maybe some of your outputs. Those are some of the ways in which you're scaffolded as you are trying to learn through your kind of social interactions with another. And that scaffolding, so this is, again, you can kind of view scaffolding as modified interaction in the previous interactionist theory that we had. So as you become more fluent in a language or more proficient, then the less there is a requirement for others to modify what they are saying, the rate of speech. There's less requirement for them to simplify language, etc., etc. And then that also links then with the zone of proximal development, which I'm not sure why there's lines going through the first line, but anyway. And this is, I put there in the third point, there's some analogies here with Krashen's I+1, that there's just kind of your current level of competency or comprehension, and then something just slightly more than that. And one of the way that you can say that in Vygotsky's terms or sociocultural theory is that it's the space between what a learner can do alone and what they can do with assistance. So, so if they can only do something with assistance, then they can't do it on their own. So there needs to be some kind of moving together of those two kind of domains. And that's usually you need some kind of mediator then to provide scaffolding, which then will enable you to be in the zone. You can view it as a Venn diagram. Often that's how it's represented. And in that, where those two things meet, what you can do and what someone else can help you do, that's the ideal space to be in terms of learning, because it's proximal, as in it's close enough for you to develop in that domain. It's not too complex, but it's also not too simple, right? Because if you just had someone else who can do the same thing as you, they can't help you to do anything new necessarily. Okay, so just that which is beyond reach. Then there's the zone of proximal development, what can be done with assistance, and then students' current understanding. So those are that's a way of understanding that. Some of you I know have encountered this in other subjects. So developmental psychology would talk quite a bit about this as a theory. So another focus point of SCT is self-regulation, and you can also, this is my own wording for it, but you can also view it as self-mediation. It's where you almost use your own faculties that you've developed as you've matured, as you've learned things, as tools. So, for instance, if you are able to regulate your emotions, let's say you've had a really bad weekend, and now it's Monday and you need to go to tutorial. If you can regulate your emotions so that you don't act out in your tutorial, but you actually say, just, calm down, I need to concentrate. Let me, I don't know if you have some like little mental ritual that you go through to focus on what you're doing and to get into a learning mode. That's a tool that's being used that you have kind of within yourself that then aids in your learning. So again, self-regulation is really where the mediator becomes yourself. Babies and kind of children struggle with self-regulation. Adults are better at it, some more than others. Yeah, and so, I mean, just in terms of language learning specifically, there's some examples. You can kind of set goals for yourself. You can monitor your progress. I'd say nowadays there's an increasing move. This is just an aside comment towards other regulation. For instance, if any of you have tried Duolingo, the way that it regulates is it sends you these really passive-aggressive notifications, in effect reminding you to do your learning for the day. So it's when you have something like that, you are effectively outsourcing the regulation of, let's say, your monitoring of progress, of goals in learning to something else, some other tool like Duolingo. And yeah, when you outsource it and when you don't, as it were, in-source or have your own self-regulation, there's always a difficulty of whether when that other regulation disappears, for instance, you can no longer, you finish a Duolingo course or your phone stops working, whether you'll continue learning or not. So there's a lot of dependency that's created, whereas self-regulation, you can use yourself as a tool to continue learning. Okay. All right, so those are some of the main elements of sociocultural theory, and you can see kind of where it intersects with Long's theory as well. There's lots of overlaps. It uses slightly different language though. And I guess at the core of it is this idea of mediation, tools that we use. And it's a bit of a difficult, I'd recommend maybe just spending a bit of time reading up and thinking about mediation within sociocultural theory, just so you can kind of wrap your head around it. Because if a person can be a mediator, a book can be a mediator, if your own faculties of that you've developed as a mature human being is also kind of something that mediates, it's kind of difficult to see all the links between those. But yeah, I encourage you just to read up and delve a bit deeper into that. So comprehensible output then, we've spoken a little bit about it, but this wasn't something that Krashen focused on. He thought that output was merely a function of any acquisition that has already occurred. So Merrill Swain came along and said, look, okay, you've got the comprehensible input hypothesis. Output's also super important, particularly in the context of interaction, because the output, the linguistic output that you give when you are interacting is precisely what allows for modified interaction, because then people realize, oh, it's incomprehensible what I've been saying to you. So, and some of the functions then that it's claimed that that output, if it's comprehended by the other, as in they understand what you are saying, and then they can understand how they should modify the interaction. So it, particularly in terms of interaction, that point number 4, it obtains feedback from others about language use. So for instance, if they repeat something that you've said but slightly change it, it allows you to notice maybe the error that you've made. So that's one way that your output is important. If you hadn't outputted anything, there would be no way that you can then, as it were, improve your monitor, to use Krashen's terminology, so that maybe the next time before you make the error, you would edit what you're going to say, right? But you had to have some output in order to be corrected notice what was corrected, and then change your next output in the next interaction, right? So that's one way in which they're thinking output is important. Also, obviously, like right now, I'll use the example of teaching in front of a class or lecturing. The more you do it, the more you get used to it, and the more automatic it can become, right? You don't have to kind of think, well, what am I going to do now? What am I going to talk about next? It just happens as you're in the flow of things. And that's where the term fluent comes from, flowing. So developmency requires you just to practice and kind of just throw out language. So that's the argument that output's super important, actually. In order to internalize rules, you actually the rules of a language and the ways of saying things, you need to just be outputting that language until it can become automatic. So it creates awareness of language knowledge gaps. That's pretty much the same as 4, but sometimes you can actually become cognizant of your own errors without someone else saying, hey, like, notice what you did there. That's not right. And then I think in the context of I mean, remember, we've spoken about overgeneralization, and that was one of the errors within error analysis. And one of the ways that you'd recognize, maybe often, I think people who are learning, particularly children, they don't realize that they're overgeneralizing, but it provides you with opportunities, particularly as a learner, a second language learner, as an adult, to experiment with the rules that you currently have and to really try them out and see whether they fit. And to test your hypotheses about language rules, and then obviously receive feedback on that. Anyway, so there's a constellation of things that it can serve, kind of comprehensible output that enable then you to learn more. To the extent to which it enables you to acquire more, that's obviously a bit of a debate between those who would try and revise Krashen for the current, I guess, state of academic knowledge in SLA versus those who think that, I guess, interaction is crucial and the explicit learning side of things. So comprehensible output also would have a lot to do with kind of explicit trying out of language rules, of editing your output. The things that Krashen would talk about is the monitor side of things. Anyway, so the idea is that it plays an important role in interaction with us. Second language acquisition. So this is, again, a modification to that focus on comprehensible input that Krashen came up with. So in summary, I'll maybe take a bit of time here, and then we'll have some time for questions as well. So interactionists, they elaborate on the innatist notion of comprehensible input. So viewing, I guess, everything that you need in order to learn a second language is already inside of you. There's that language acquisition device. You have, as it were, the parameters for whatever second language version of the second language that you're coming up with. Those parameters are set by the universal grammar that's still in operation to some degree. And that's, I guess, the view that if just comprehensible input is all you need, then that would be the way that you would acquire things. That input then would interact with kind of the elements of universal grammar that you still have access to as someone beyond the critical period. But then the interactionists come and they elaborate upon that innatist notion and say, actually, it's about input and output, and it's the interaction. So to use Lichtman and Van Patten's language, it's that kind of the input and the output is embedded in communication, right? It has to take place within some social context for it to be valuable, right? And for it to result in acquisition. Then interactionists would say, and this applies, I guess, both to Michael Long's version of interactionist theory as well as sociocultural theory, just in different terms, that modified interaction is what makes comprehensible inputs comprehensible. There's a negotiation of meaning There's scaffolding or support structures that are used, the simplification strategies that first language speaker would use for a learner of that language. And that's precisely what makes input comprehensible. So that's, I guess, one of the core claims of the interactionists, that input cannot just be comprehensible kind of on its own in the absence of interaction. So sociocultural theory then introduces, I guess, social interaction. You can argue that the interactionists also said that, but for them, they weren't really looking at the social part of two people being together. It was more the fact of an interaction happening. So it was their level of analysis was not at there being kind of two individuals who are behaving in a certain way in relation to each other. It was more that behavior, that interactive behavior, that was the focus of their theorizing. So the social cultural theory is obviously looking at that. It would view that as mediation, but then it's obviously you have more knowledgeable others. So that's their way of saying, I guess, maybe a first language speaker who would help you, who would mediate the language for you. And then part of what they're doing as they're mediating it to make it within your zone of proximal development is that they are scaffolding it, which is the modified interaction strategies of Michael Long. So yeah, the interaction with a more knowledgeable other. So there you finally see that acronym. If you ever see that elsewhere, that's what it refers to. They scaffold the language learning process. And this is something I didn't touch on too much earlier when I was discussing kind of, I guess, the pillars of sociocultural theory, but you can see that for them, language learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's always in the context of social and cultural activity. So that's where the name comes from. And that's what provides the motivations as well as the tools for people to do learning, particularly language learning. That's where it emerges from. Language, literally, the phenomenon of language emerges from people trying to communicate, right? And if hand signals or I don't know, grunting or whatever, it doesn't work, you're going to get more kind of complex ways of communication, and then that's what language comes from. So language itself develops from sociocultural interactions, but then also language learning, the motivations for that in the same way come from social and cultural phenomena. And once, particularly, I mean, in the case of second language acquisition, like they're saying right at the very bottom there, it becomes an individual psychological phenomenon once you've already acquired a first language, right? And maybe it's at that stage then that some of the other theories we have, which are more cognitive focused, just looking at kind of how the brain does it, or behavioral, looking at the behaviors of an individual. But all of those theories don't really look at the social factors involved. Okay, so before I get to the notices, I just want to also give you some context for what we'll be looking at next week. So next week, we're going to be delving more into the individual differences. We've looked, I'm not really going to spend too much more time on grand theories or grand theorizing about SLA, but we're going to be looking at, for instance, what makes an individual learn a language quicker or slower or with more effectiveness. And there's multiple different ways in which we can look at that. We can look at specifically the social factors. So there's some overlaps there with sociocultural theory. We can also look at the individual factors. And I mean, individual differences. Obviously, individuals have different social factors that are applying to them, right? So social factors themselves are also individual differences. And then also cognitive. So there's the cognitive side, there's the social side, there's the affective side, and we've already seen a little bit of that in Krashen's affective filter theory, but we're going to delve deeper into different kinds of affective factors, some which might produce a higher affective filter, to use Krashen's language, others which might produce a lower affective filter. Okay, so that's what's coming up next week. So we're going to have 3 lectures. So I'll see you on Friday, at least a third of you on Friday for TUTS. but then Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So I'll be taking the Dorney lecture as well as the Wednesday lecture. And we're going to be looking at individual differences across those three, the cognitive, the social, and the affective. And then, yeah, you can read the rest for yourself. Otherwise, we're finishing 5 minutes early. Thanks, everyone.